The Hanging Man. Nobody had told me about the Hanging Man when I moved into the flat. Nobody had spoken to me at all. All three of the tenants who shared the block seemed withdrawn and aloof, returning my greetings with nothing but a blank, shadowed stare, as if they couldn't really see me. Maybe they didn't expect me to last long. I couldn't see myself staying either. Not with the dust that coated the skirting boards and filled the air like static, or the naked light bulbs that hung from the sloped ceiling, full of dried-up insects. The walls inside my flat were stained yellow, and there were cracks running across the ceiling right above my bed. There was a smell in there, too, that clung to the edges of the room like damp or mildew. I had noticed the cracks on my first night there. There was a single fissure, less than a millimeter across, running right through the middle of the ceiling. It spiderwebbed into lots of smaller fractures, like the way glass shatters, splintering off into little pieces. There was a ceiling fan, too, an old piece of junk. One of the blades was broken, snapped at an angle so that it dangled awkwardly, and the motor was covered in dark, red rust. There had been a pulley once, but now half of the cord was missing, leaving nothing but a frayed piece of string. The fan liked to move on its own. I noticed that on the second day, waking up in the middle of the night to see it swinging ever so slightly, rotating half an inch one way before going the other. I assumed there was a draft. There were definitely holes around the window. I could hear the wind whistling through them when everything else was quiet. It wasn't too bothersome once I had disciplined myself not to look up every time I caught movement in the corner of my eye. One night, I woke up to the sound of squeaking, like hinges that needed oiling. The fan was moving again, but more fitfully than usual. The rust on the motor was chafing the blades as it spun, creating a horrible grating noise. I stared straight up at it, watching the moving fan throw shadows over the ceiling, distorting the lights of car headlamps that glared through the window. I fell back asleep to the grating squeal of the blades and straight into a dream. By the time I woke up, I'd forgotten most of it, but it left me feeling deeply uncomfortable and disconcerted, even if I couldn't remember why. The dream came to me in snatches throughout the day. When I glanced in the bathroom mirror that evening, for a moment my shadow had looked odd against the wall, the head at a strange angle to my body as it folded over the shower tiles. When I shifted, it corrected itself. But it had triggered a memory of the shadow in my dream. It had been a faceless figure, turned away from me, but I remember getting the sense that they were angry, as if their whole body were writhing with rage. Then there had been the sound of shattering glass, and a horrible scream, and that's when I had woken up. I hadn't thought it odd at the time. I figured it was just my mind twisting itself into knots over the move. It had been a stressful build-up getting here, tragic breakup, sudden job dismissal. I was at a bit of a dead end in life, meandering along like those cracks in the wall. The next night, I dreamt again, and it wasn't until I heard the fan squeaking later that day that I remembered it, the same as last time. The shadow figure, coiled in anger, and then the smashed glass, and the wet slice of skin, and then the screaming. The horrible, horrible scream. A couple of days later, the cracks started to get worse. I woke up one morning after a restless night and saw that the lines running across the wall were no longer shallow fractures, but deeper, thicker. They looked more like veins running deep into the plaster. I wondered if I ought to tell the landlord, but he was just as elusive as the rest of the tenants, and I didn't know how to contact him. I dragged myself out of bed and into the bathroom, splashing my face with icy water. For a moment, I saw red, and I remembered the dream, the glass, and then slice and the scream. But it was just rusted around the rim of the tap. Drying my face, I heard the sudden of the ceiling fan cranking around in a circle. I paused at the door, listening to it. It sounded loud, spinning almost urgently. When I peeked around the bathroom door, I sucked in a sharp breath. Between one blink and the next, there had been a shadow, right in the middle of the room, hanging down from the fan. I hadn't had the chance to tell if it was humanoid, if it was moving, if it was real. All I saw was a thing, hanging there, and the ceiling fan moving jerkily above it. Even as I watched, the fan eventually stuttered to a stop, the motor grinding quietly. I stepped back into the bathroom, closing the door, telling myself I had imagined it. There hadn't been anything there, surely. Just a trick of the light. I waited a few minutes, counting each beat of my heart as it thudded against my ribs, and then stepped out again. Nothing. There was nothing hanging from the ceiling. The fan barely twitched. That night I had the same dream. The shadow and the shatter and the scream, and then the soft creaking of rope that followed me into wakefulness, sounding as though it was coming from the room. When I opened my eyes, it was above me, the figure dangling from the ceiling fan. I scrambled up in bed, my face twisting in horror. This time, no matter how many times I blinked, it didn't disappear. I could see the thin outline of rope etched in shadow knotted around his neck. And his neck, God, his neck, the way it twisted, bent over to the side as though it was held together by nothing but rope and a thin stretch of skin. The man had no distinguishing features, no face. It was just a shadow swinging back and forth with the gentle grinding of rope filling the silence. The plasterboard above the fan was groaning too, and more cracks appeared over the ceiling like black, bloody wounds, veins running over the wall, glass shattering, blood leaking out. I tumbled out of bed, my body trembling, unable to take my eyes off the man hanging above me. I felt sick, and my body covered in sweat, a chill racking down my spine. My chest felt hollow, my lungs parachuting desperately to keep up with each staggering breath. In my head, I saw blood and glass and a body on the ground, crumpled and unmoving. I shook my head, trying to clear the images from my mind. They weren't mine. They didn't belong to me. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. The man kept swinging, his feet only inches above the bed, the rope knotted around his neck, his shadow going back and forth, back and forth. No pulse, no breath. Too much blood. Too much blood. I dropped to my knees, covered my eyes. I couldn't stand it, couldn't stand seeing those horrid delusions. The fan kept grinding. The rope kept creaking. The glass kept shattering. The blood kept pooling. I wondered when it would stop, when this nightmare would end, but it didn't. Minutes passed. Hours. I thought the sun should be rising soon, spilling light over the room, making the hanging man disappear. But the room remained a cavernous hollow. No light outside the window. No stars in the sky. Just endless darkness. I felt disgusted, staring down at my hands, seeing red everywhere I looked. It hadn't been my fault. I hadn't meant to do it. My anger had gotten the better of me, had made me snap, and I pushed her. I pushed her too hard, and she hit the glass, and the glass went into her, and there was so much blood all over my hands, all over her body. It had been an accident. I hadn't meant to do it. But now the blood wouldn't come off, and the guilt made me feel hollow, and I could hear the rope calling to me in its creaking whispers. Guilty. You're guilty. You deserve to die for your sins. Could I really go on like this? Hating myself every second of the day, not being able to think about her without thinking about the blood, about all that blood that had come out of her. Something slivered around my throat like a cold breath and squeezed. I gasped, my neck creaking and straining like the rope, and when I looked down, I was no longer on the floor, but hanging from the ceiling, my feet dangling in the air. And I realized, as my own guilt choked me, that the hanging man was me.